Hey Jennifer, how you doing?
Good morning, Ricardo. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for joining us.
Likewise.
I was just giving everyone a brief introduction about you, just so they had some background. I got all the way up to the point where you were associate director of the UCLA Clinical and Translational Science Institute. Very importantly, principal investigator of the I-6 Challenge Grant from the U.S. Economic Development Administration that really catalyzes development of medical technology in Southern California. Very impressive CV as way of background. She's a Fulbright scholar, MS and BS in mechanical engineering from MIT, where she was a Draper Fellow, BS from the MIT School of Management, and a PhD in mechanical engineering from Stanford University. So incredible background. Glad to have you on here. And we're going to be talking about entrepreneurship and how to excel. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Ricardo. Nice to be talking to someone on the East Coast who's from the warmer parts right now of the East Coast at the very least.
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, you said that you're a Patriots fan. I just wanted to bring that up. It's a little bit of a tough year, first bad year in a while, but I think they'll bounce back.
I think so. It's all about cyclic markets, and so we're just at an inflection point right now. And I think that certainly, having lived in LA for the past 8 years, I think there's some momentum to be headed eastward.
I hear you. I hear you. So let's just start very broadly, and just for the audience, what does entrepreneurship mean to you?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think coming from a clinical and an academic perspective, it can mean a little bit different to folks that are in our shoes. So really, fundamentally, entrepreneurship is a process of discovery, and when you think of some of the great explorers, in our history, entrepreneurship has taken many forms, and I think that entrepreneurship has really evolved in the US and probably globally to take on two different meanings, and that we have your traditional kind of Silicon Valley entrepreneur, if you will, meaning that they're starting the new tech startup. And we also have the more sort of mom and pop entrepreneur, right? So in the 70s, we saw globalization, we saw the advent of many changes in our entrepreneurial structure within the US, meaning that many of the new companies were no longer those small businesses. Even, your Dunkin' Donuts and your Starbucks, those are franchises. So those don't count as small businesses in your small towns across America. And so what we actually see now is a decline in entrepreneurship in America, but that's not because we fundamentally meaning that Silicon Valley hasn't gotten a record number of funding in 2020, but that our definition of entrepreneurship has slightly changed, and it'll remain to be seen, if we can ever regain that sort of traditional entrepreneur, if you will, as it's carried our nation through kind of the first part of the 20th century.
Now, why is it so important? Why is it so important to foster entrepreneurship? I mean, that's the goal of your job. And why do you feel like it's so important to inspire people to improve the way we live and to make technology better?
Yeah, fundamentally, being in the healthcare sector, there's nothing else we can do but innovate and try to constantly do better for patients and deliver lower cost and better value to patients that ultimately results in better quality of life. And I think entrepreneurship is one of the mechanisms through which we can do that. And at a more of a national level, entrepreneurship is about the creation of jobs historically, right? Because multinationals, typically only about 2% of their job growth comes from within the US. And so what we see is a lot of startups, if you look at the kind of the macro data, a lot of the startups, those jobs are coming from within the US. And so in terms of sustaining our economy, and a lot of what that I-6 Regional Challenge Grant is about creating jobs within specific regions that need economic assistance, that need to develop high growth, high impact sectors, such as MedTech, such as the life sciences.
Interesting. And what do you think makes a great entrepreneur? If you could say, what are the top three qualities of a great entrepreneur, what would those be?
Yeah, well, Ricardo, you can probably help me out here, but I'll have to borrow an example given to me by a colleague by the name of Elliot Kotek, one of the co-founders of Not Impossible, and currently CEO and founder of Nation of Artists. And he's a decorated documentarian and social activist within the entrepreneurial space. And what Elliot always says is about people, passion, and purpose. And really, the entrepreneurs fundamentally always know what's their purpose, what's driving them. And as you talked about being in healthcare, our purpose is to do better for patients. And it's really about, once you have that purpose, you have your passion, who are your people? Because when you think about innovation capital, can you get your ideas to succeed? Can you get your idea to market? Well, you can only do that if you have the right people. So you have to go out and you have to find your people. And, in the clinical setting or academic setting, sometimes it's hard to find those people because we don't have entrepreneurs and residents typically right outside the door of on Westwood Avenue, where we're based here in Los Angeles. So what we really try to do in programs like ours is bring people in from the outside to the academic setting. And that might be folks from industry, it might be angel and venture capital investors, it might be alumni. We found the UCLA Alumni Network to be extremely valuable in fostering entrepreneurship on our campus. And so I really think we have to do a little bit more legwork to often find the people to come to us in the academic setting to help us foster those great ideas that our faculty and staff have.
I mean, I think you really hit it on the head when you said that you have to have a passion and know your purpose. And I feel like when people are passionate about what they do and they know the purpose is to improve a particular area, that's where you're really going to excel. And I'm going to read a quote of yours and just have you explain it. I read this on your website. I thought it was very apropos, but when you said that as technology and medicine converge, strong fundamentals in both innovation and healthcare management are critical skills to become future leaders in industry. If you could just explain that quote, I think it's great.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ricardo. I think as an educator and also an entrepreneur, we kind of, myself, I find we have to straddle two worlds. And from wearing my kind of educational hat for a minute, there's sort of that, can you teach innovation? Can you teach entrepreneurship? Can you teach creativity? And I think fundamentally you can teach all three. And when I look at, our business school candidates coming into the Anderson School of Management at UCLA, and I think about the career options that are available to them, those opportunities have expanded greatly. And what I mean by that is, some people talk about, technologies coming into healthcare. Technology is new to healthcare. Technology has always been a fundamental part of healthcare. Healthcare is built on both providers and patients, and the technology that enables clinicians like yourselves to do the complex surgeries that you perform. But what we're seeing now are really two primary enablers, and that technology is now becoming an enabler of healthcare along with data. And that's really driving the digital transformation of healthcare. And I think that that's opening new career opportunities, and it's also opening new business models that are fundamental for our MBA students to be able to understand, meaning that they're not just going to go to, Medtronic or Amgen or Johnson & Johnson. They could go to Walmart, they could go to CVS, they could go to Google, they could go to Microsoft, they could go to Best Buy. I mean, as we think about the consumerization of healthcare that's driven by the digital transformation, there are so many new career opportunities that enable, students from programs across the country and the globe to pursue alternative career paths within healthcare and have that, sense of purpose that many folks who have traditionally studied medicine or nursing or what we call like traditional healthcare fields have really only been able to find.
Yeah, I mean, I think you, again, hit it on the head when you say that if someone is going to make a difference, they have to not only be good at medicine, but if they're going to be a leader, they have to know how to improve the field. Because honestly, if you're complacent, if you're not moving forward, then you're moving backwards. And so the real leaders in the field that are always trying to improve, I think those are going to be the real innovators and the real, entrepreneurs. In your experience, what has been typically the biggest barriers towards entrepreneurship?
Yeah, that's a great one. I can take a little bit of a different perspective, assuming that I'm no longer at Stanford, I'm not in the Valley. I think there's this sort of diffusion of innovation, a diffusion of entrepreneurship that we've seen, along with the tide of globalization, but particularly in areas like Los Angeles that have not been, life science hubs, if you will. And what I mean by that is that, capital is not as readily accessible. The office and wet lab and space that you need to start a life science startup is not as readily available, or maybe some of the fundamental resources of those people that we talked about are not available within your region. And so I think as we see that diffusion of innovation and diffusion of entrepreneurship, and we see more and more of these kind of regional hotspots, and sometimes I'm sure as many folks might recall, right, that Economist cover, right, the death of the valley, and everyone's like getting out of it because the rent's too high and everyone's going to go to Texas and other areas within the nation. But I think it's fundamentally, yes, there's that piece of it, but there's also just the fundamental piece that innovation is becoming more accessible and entrepreneurship is becoming more accessible. And some of those barriers that have historically existed, particularly we've seen in 2020, where we had record funding, almost a doubling over of funding in some key sectors in 2020. Thank you, John. I'm going to predict that we're going to continue to see that, and we're going to continue to see more of these sort of micro funds within different regions that are capitalized by health systems or philanthropists or industry corporates that are based in those regions.
Now, you have to deal with the FDA a lot, I'm sure, as new medical devices come about, as the ideas come about. Now, the FDA is probably the world's strictest, most stringent, it makes having novel devices very difficult, a very arduous process, both a blessing and a curse, right? It's safe for the public, but it makes innovation very difficult. Tell us a little bit about the FDA approval process.
Yeah, well, I'm going to have to go ahead and I'm not going to take the fifth, but for the sake of time, I think that one of the key pieces we see in the FDA regulatory process is obviously safety and efficacy, right? That's the number one goal of our regulatory system. But what I've also fundamentally see is a big shift, right? I think that the FDA has, in particular in 2020 aside, the hundreds of EUAs granted in 2020 for diagnostics and other therapies. And I know that the folks at the FDA have really been working night and day, because I know entrepreneurs that have been getting calls and emails from the FDA on Sunday night at 11 p.m. And other times reviewers are working around the clock. But I think that to put that aside for a second, if we look at kind of the past decade, there's really been a fundamental shift in programs, particularly at CDH, which is what I can focus on for my area of expertise. But the breakthrough device exemption, the expansion of that initial innovation pathway. And what we're actually seeing now is, in terms of barriers, I think reimbursement is actually the new regulatory, if you will. And that, 10 years ago, regulatory was the big hurdle that we anticipated it was going to be. But that is somewhat shifted, I think, in that getting CMS coverage is no longer like a kind of a ticket to getting private payer coverage. And that getting, local CMS coverage is no longer as easy, or we'll say is not as much of a challenge as potentially, getting those national coverage decisions. And private payers within different regions are not giving consistent coverage across various regions as well. So I think that we're going to fundamentally see, and I think that the new proposed MCIT rule is an example of how CMS is responding to catch up with where FDA is, right? To catch up with the breakthrough technology designation and be able to help push those therapies. Because if you don't have, the way MCIT works, or is proposed to work, right, is that if you get a breakthrough device designation and you receive FDA approval, you'll be guaranteed 4 years of national Medicare coverage, which is fundamentally transformational, and a lot of credit to CMS for proposing that new rule. But if you don't have a code, how is that going to function? And that kind of, I think, shows just where we talk about what are the barriers. And that could potentially be a barrier because the AMA is responsible for codes, assigning codes in medical technology. And so there's a little bit of a stopgap here, and it remains to be seen what will happen, as 2021 unfolds. We have a new administration coming in, and healthcare policy and reform is always the top of the list, it seems. But I want to say one other thing, just as an aside, separate from our national regulatory policy, is that globally we're seeing a shift as well, because MDR within Europe is potentially going to become a much stricter set of regulatory rules than the US, with the in-country representation required and several of the other proposed facets of MDR. Granted, MDR was delayed until 2021. So that, I think we're watching that closely from an industry perspective to see how MDR will unfold in Europe, and if that sort of perception that the US is the strictest system in the world holds true in the next decade.
I mean, it's fascinating how the process is really transforming over the last decade. How do you bypass many of those hurdles, right? Or, well, not really bypass, but how do you fast track? Let's say someone comes to you with a great idea. Money and regulations are really the two big obstacles that you've mentioned. How do you kind of fuel these ideas and push through these roadblocks?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, fundamentally in healthcare, we're sometimes a little bit held to a higher standard in that, what we're expected to show in terms of that burden of proof to get that initial investor funding is so much higher than it is in other sectors like retail and tech, and other consumer-based driven industries. And what I like to encourage entrepreneurs is, yes, you need to think about your minimum viable product, which is, a fundamental, at least, from a perspective, how we teach entrepreneurship at Anderson is, thinking about that MVP. But what I think is really important about healthcare and how we cannot get too lost in the weeds is what's the minimum viable proof of concept? The MVPOC is what I tell my students. And that, sometimes a proof of concept is enough to sort of get that initial investor interest, to get that momentum within your institution, to get some seed funding, because the minimum viable product in healthcare can be 5 to 7 years down the road. And that's not realistic in terms of putting yourself to that standard to get your initial check in the door. And so I think that staging it out and having some sort more intermediate or near-term milestones, if you will, can be really helpful to sort of break that process up into small pieces. What's my benchtop set of studies? What's my small animal model? And if you can prove that concept, whether it's a novel or an existing mechanism of action, that goes a long way to helping bring first money in the door.
I'm going to talk a little bit about what you are doing at UCLA, because I think you guys are really setting the standard for many other institutions in terms of sparking entrepreneurship, sparking innovation. Tell us about UCLA Biodesign.
Yeah, of course. I have to preface my answer with the fact that UCLA Biodesign is really a team effort, and that's driven by my co-lead, Desert Horse Grant, the Senior Director of Research and Innovation at UCLA Health, as well as our clinical director, Dr. Nirav Kamdar. And really, UCLA Biodesign, just as a sort of fine print, if you will, I trained at Stanford under Paul Yock, who was one of the founders of Stanford Biodesign, and I went through the Stanford Biodesign graduate program. So a lot of the inspiration that I took from my time at Stanford and MIT, sort of two of our leading technical institutions here in the States, was around driving innovation forward from an academic setting. And when I arrived at UCLA, and I realized, wow, I'm at the #1 hospital in California, the #4 hospital in the nation. We should be using our health system as a mechanism to not only drive innovation and advancement of technology for patients, but also help train future healthcare leaders. And so UCLA Biodesign's mission is really around those two things: advancing technology for healthcare and training future healthcare leaders. And we do that through a postgraduate fellowship that brings not only our own clinical trainees, residents and fellows and faculty, but also industry experts who have designed medical devices and who have launched businesses in other healthcare or other sectors.
Wonderful. And really along those lines, tell us about the MedTech Innovator Accelerator program.
Yeah, another sort of great program that was instrumental in the very beginning. When I think back, I was thinking about it this morning, when I think back to almost 5 years ago now, or even 6 years ago when MedTech Innovator first got out of the ground, and a colleague came to me and said, I have an idea. And I said, oh, well, I could use your help. And I said, oh, great. What's the idea? I want to build a MedTech accelerator. And I said, okay, well, why don't you send me what you have and we'll get started. And he said, that's it. And I said, okay, well, let's figure out where we can get this launched and how we can do it. And I'd already previously done some research on around 200 healthcare accelerator programs at the time globally. And I narrowed that down to about the top 25 or so. And granted, this is the academic approach, but a little bit of my academic meets entrepreneurial approach. Narrowed down to about the top 25. And what I discovered at the time is that that accelerator model was changing. That old model of, I'm going to give you 25K, I'm going to give you 50K, I'm going to give you 100K, and you're going to give me 6%. That model was, one, proving not to be a profitable, sustainable model for many healthcare accelerator programs. And two, it wasn't necessarily in the best interests of the startup company or the accelerator, because you didn't really know what you were getting for your money. And then you didn't know what you were giving up necessarily because you were so early, you don't have an understanding of your true valuation. And so MedTech Innovator was fundamentally built on a nonprofit model, meaning that entrepreneurs are coming in and that MedTech Innovator is serving as a nonprofit vehicle to drive innovation with the assistance of industry leaders like Johnson & Johnson and AdvaMed, who have been really fundamental in really advancing the platform to the world's largest accelerator for medical technology today.
Now, one of the most interesting things that I see is that I-6 challenge grant, which you guys got from the U.S. government. And I feel like, obviously at UCLA, huge institution, many great ideas, being proposed. How do you vet them out? How do you pick which ideas to fund and support? Very difficult question, but need to hear it.
Yeah, it's, I think a lot of it's similar to what you might look for in a resident or a fellow, when you're bringing someone onto your team, and that you're looking for folks with those three qualities we mentioned earlier, really, the passion, the purpose, and the people. And what we think about is the team is really important. A lot of what we're seeing, and a lot of our most successful teams that we're seeing, and this is really what UCLA Biodesign is based on, is interdisciplinary collaboration. And that's really brings together both the technical and the clinical skill set, because we have so many entrepreneurs coming to us looking for clinical partners. They're 2, 3 years, 4 years into their venture. And one of the things that being at such a large institution offers is early interdisciplinary collaboration. So I think that's one of the key things that we look for. We, not necessarily what you might hear on the industry side from, I know my colleagues in venture would say the same. You look for someone with a demonstrated team record. But that's not always the case. We have the freedom and the ability to recognize our rising stars. And that's a lot of, what we look for in our UCLA Biodesign Fellows, is that we're looking for those rising stars, those first-time innovators, and that you don't need to have a track record of 5 successful startups to get funding from us to be able to move forward. And that's one of the novel things that we're able to offer through mechanisms like the UCLA Health Innovation Competition that Desert administers, as well as a broader campus program called the UCLA Innovation Fund, which grants larger seed grants to faculty and innovators within the UCLA campus that have promising MedTech and therapeutic projects.
I mean, it's amazing how you guys foster all these ideas and really push technology ahead. Take us in a kind of step-by-step fashion. Let's say someone is at UCLA Med, they have a biotech idea, they come to you. What are the steps how someone at UCLA goes from concept to reality?
Yeah, and we asked ourselves the same question about a year ago, and as a result, we created what's called the UCLA Biodesign Accelerator track. And this is really a fellowship program for faculty and staff that have, again, proof of concept, maybe a working prototype, maybe kind of, they're not even quite at that minimum viable proof of concept yet, or minimum viable product. We're talking way kind of upstream from that in the development process. Because what we find is that, you get to a point in the academic grant cycle where, you sort of can't really go much further because you want to take either a pivot, right, or a potential tangent that's going to drive a business opportunity. And so I think being able to offer that kind of bridge funding, if you will, or kind of proof of concept funding is so important. And that's one of the things that we've been able to do through the UCLA Biodesign Accelerator program, is not just there's funding available, but there's support available, in such that you can understand what your regulatory burden is going to be. You can understand your business model. And we do that in collaboration with our business school. We're so fortunate, having come from MIT and from Boston, where I grew up and was raised as a Boston sports fan, as you noted earlier. But, I spent many mornings waiting on Longfellow Bridge for the Red Line to go meet my collaborators in a, January morning like today. And it was really cold on Longfellow Bridge, if I was walking across, or however I was getting over to MGH. And we're so fortunate that everything is just right on the UCLA campus, and that Anderson, our business school, and our engineering school are literally within a stone's throw distance from each other. So that certainly helps in terms of building that accelerator, because we can create a little bit of, we talk about top-down and bottom-up innovation, but we can create that sort of bottom-up culture of bringing people together from different parts of our campus.
Yeah, it's exceptional to hear that. What advice would you give anyone listening who wants to be an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think anyone can be an entrepreneur, right? And I think that one of the things is that we hear is, entrepreneurs are risk takers. And I think that's true. Certainly I would agree with that in many parts. But I think that even more so is that entrepreneurs are risk makers. And that if you're fundamentally doing something that's disruptive, evolutionary, has never been done before, you're creating the opportunity to take the risk, but you're making the risk that you need to take. And that's what really disruptive innovation to me is. And so it's really being comfortable with risk, but the concept of creating risk that you can overcome.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like calculated risk. Obviously, no one wants to be foolish, but It's about leaving a mark, leaving a legacy, making what we do better, and never being satisfied with the current status quo, because you can always do it better. Wrapping up here, just because it's been half an hour and I know you're super busy, what does your crystal ball look like? You being at the forefront of kind of technology and medicine, innovation, entrepreneurship, tell us what you think it's going to look like in the next 10 years, 20 years, 50 years.
Yeah, Ricardo, I might ask you the same, but I'll go first, if you will. And I think that what we've seen fundamentally is healthcare has always borne the brunt of being, a monolithic institution, if you will, and that we're so much slower to change than many other industries like, finance and retail that we mentioned before. And I think that what we're going to see, partly driven by that digital transformation we talked about through data and technology, but we're going to see a much more flexible and agile healthcare structure, in that when there is a new discovery, a new technology in the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to be able to adapt that much quicker. It's not going to take us 10 years to fully implement an EMR system in our nation or in other places, and that we'll see many more trends affected by globalization of healthcare, meaning that certainly the coronavirus pandemic has been a downstream example where we've been affected by the globalization of healthcare, but in the same way, we'll be able to respond more quickly to future crises or new technologies that are developed.
Yeah, I mean, I think you really hit a spot here when you talk about the EMR system, because EMR has been just the bane of everyone's existence in healthcare, and the fact that it's so difficult to do an EMR, and the fact that a patient can have healthcare at UCLA, and let's say they move to Chicago, their healthcare records, it's painful to get the healthcare records. I would assume that in the next 10 years, there's going to be a centralized system where if you get an MRI in Los Angeles, a doctor in Chicago or New York or Miami, with the patient's permission, should be able to access that and the medical records. Right now, they have to burn a CD. They got to send the CD. It's got to be uploaded. I mean, it seems like we're still in the 1980s when it comes to medical record technology.
Yeah,
Do you agree with that?
You're fundamentally right, and I'm sure we send plenty of patients, with referrals all over the world, and we receive patients with referrals from all over the world, and I certainly hope that technology will continue to enable us to have those conversations, for clinicians like yourself, to be able to provide better care, and use a system that's easier to navigate.
Yeah, it's got to be something that is kind of universal. I mean, you would think that in this day and age, you would have a universal medical record system where people can have access rather than the current cumbersome system. But wrapping up here, just because again, I know you're busy, I want to say thank you for all you do. You and Desert make a real kick-ass team. You guys are awesome. You guys really set the bar high for all the other institutions. It'd be great if every institution had a program like UCLA that is kind of fostering entrepreneurship, because that's how you inspire change. And I'm sure there's people at other institutions that have great ideas, but don't know where to take them. They don't know how to push them forward. And so kudos to you guys for really providing a pathway.
Well, thank you, Ricardo, and I'll pass along your sentiment to Desert as well. And thanks to you for having me this morning. Great conversation. Really enjoyed chatting, and look forward to keeping the discussion going.
All right, and go Pats in 2021. Okay.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.